I'm with Professor Richard Price, who's Professor of the History of Christianity at Heythrop College, part of the University of London, discussing the issue of freedom and determinism. Now, the idea of human freedom is essential for various theodicies, the attempts to try and explain why there is evil in the world. Thinkers like Alvin Plantinga in the States has a free will defense, which says evil is due to the action of created and dependent beings, whether human beings or angelic beings, and God prizes love and a free response to God so highly that God creates dependent beings who can choose to respond to God or to reject God. Evil, then, is not in any way due to God, but to the free actions of dependent and created beings. What's your reaction to that sort of position?
There are a whole number of objections I would wish to make to it. The first is that it attaches an extraordinary value to the exercise of freedom, meaning the freedom where you've got a choice, where you're not strongly inclined either one way or the other, where you could easily go either way. Now, if God values that freedom, it must be because it gives the real possibility for people to make the right choice. But is it not rather irresponsible of God to give that freedom to people who are morally weak, whom he will foreknow in his total knowledge are actually going to fail? The position I prefer is a position that recognises that human beings don't start with that sort of freedom, that in fact the way we behave is basically strongly determined by our character and various accidental factors, but that of his mercy God rescues some of us from that. He gives us the grace that enables us to overcome our weakness and to follow the divine guidance. Now, the objection made to that is that, well, why then does God refuse that help and that grace to people we read about, might occasionally even meet, whose lives go seriously wrong? Now, the stress on the free will defense is to say that no, but God, to respect freedom, can't intervene. He has to let things go wrong for some people. Now, that is not, to me, not at all obvious. Yes, perhaps desirable that God gives that scope for choice for people who are really morally mature and have a really developed freedom. But it would just seem irresponsible for God to give that freedom to people who are still morally very weak. In the same way, it would be quite irresponsible for a parent to give a small child the freedom that in fact leads to that child undergoing some dreadful accident.
But doesn't that mean that effectively you've got a type of spiritual apartheid, where God chooses to give grace to some and not to others, and effectively doesn't that seem equally unfair?
Well, the fact is that life isn't fair, and if we believe in a God who isn't simply a sort of abstract Big Bang who set the show going at the beginning but remains in control of his world, it is manifest that God does not bestow every possible benefit on each one of his creatures. Now, I know that that is in a way strange. Why is he not more generous? But being realistic, seeing the world as it is, what we observe is that some people have very happy lives, other people have terrible misfortunes, some people are, as I said, saved, rescued by divine grace, and others are not. Now, this is indeed a problem. What is going on here? I would suggest two possible solutions. One is to say that God does not, and therefore it must be the case that he is not obliged to bestow every possible benefit on all his creatures. Now, if we think what's going to happen after death, well, what the promise is for those whom God has chosen as his elect is that they will be not simply have a happy life after death, but be carried up into heaven, transformed, enabled to behold God face to face, enjoy the bliss of the beatific vision. Now that is an extraordinary gift. It's as great as the gift of reason. Now God has not bestowed the gift of reason on all the animals he has created. Strange perhaps, But if he's not obliged to do that, it doesn't seem to me that he's obliged to so transform everybody that they enjoy the beatific vision. People lead a life in this world that is basically enjoyable. And in fact, the vast, overwhelming majority of the human race, life offers something absolutely wonderful, something really positive, the huge scope for exercising, developing one's interests, exercising choice, a rich range of experiences. And I think God can reasonably say that he is offered to all. He is not obliged to give everybody the very special grace that will lead them to be transformed and enjoy eternal bliss with him.
So this is full-scale predestination.
Yes.
Effectively, let me make sure I'm clear on what you're saying. God gives the gift of life and the happiness that comes from life to everyone, and that's a great blessing. To a group, however large that may be, he chose to give another gift, which is the possibility of the beatific vision. But we are completely determined. There is nothing that we can do about it, except presumably to pray for grace. Is that a possibility?
Yes.
One could pray for grace if one does not get it. But effectively then, the whole idea of freedom is an illusion. We're actually completely determined theologically. And in that case, why is there so much evil and suffering? Yes, you've said the world has a great beauty, but there's also the most terrible suffering in Rwanda, in the Holocaust, in Darfur, cancer patients. If you're not going to explain evil on free will, why does God not create a hedonistic paradise and avoid the suffering and evil there is in the world?
Well, I think I could suggest that God has created such a world, but it's not ours. We have no reason to suppose that we're in the only universe that exists. Right. All that I think is necessary, the point of view of theodicy, justifying God, is to say that this particular world has its value, resulting from its own particular character. However, having said that, there's also attraction in a view that ultimately everyone will be saved and enjoy that transformation that will lead to eternal bliss in God.
But that's not a traditional Christian position, is it?
There's been much debate recently as to whether the New Testament teaches eternal torment for the wicked. And the fact is that this teaching comes in some parts of the New Testament, notably the Gospel of Matthew. It is entirely absent from the writings of St. Paul and from the Gospel of St. John. It is not therefore a central and necessary part of traditional biblical Christian belief. Well, what is you might say, then going to happen to the wicked? Well, the truth is that an absolutely clear or common answer is not given. I think there are passages that do actually suggest that simply the wicked cease to exist. And you've already made some objections to that. The teaching that ultimately all may be saved is not, I admit, directly stated by the Bible, but it is something which many of the greatest minds in Christianity have been ready to deduce from their very strong sense, based on the Bible, that God is a God of love. Now, in this case, a key question becomes, this being led up, transformed, it must involve human freedom in some sense. That I absolutely concede. But the question is, what really is the true nature of a human freedom that has real value and that people actually possess? Now, the trouble I have with the so-called free will defense, that we're all put in a situation when we can make this great momentous choice between good or evil, is that it seems to be, in fact, that's a weakness, a deficiency, if we find ourselves, as it were, equally open to good or evil, in the same way we might choose equally to fly to Paris or to go on Eurostar. But I have a very obvious objection to this, that is, you don't have to talk about theology. It's that when I look round in the world, I don't actually see people exercising this fundamental choice. I mean, take some criminal who goes around assaulting old women, burglary with violence, if you look at that person's home background, you'll probably find that this was somebody with a frightful upbringing. He was brought up without love, without support, in an atmosphere where criminality was taken for granted. What chance did he have? Or take to a good, upright member of the Christian church. Why is he like that? Because heroically, when he was really faced with the choice between good and evil, and both were possible, evil had its attractions, he made the right choice? No, because probably he was brought up in a good, loving, but strict family. He had fortunate education, influences from friends and mentors, and so he grows up as the sort of person who just would be quite incapable of going out and knocking an old woman over the head.
So the whole idea of freedom is an illusion.
Of that kind, I think it is an illusion. Now, the freedom that, for example, St. Augustine said is so valuable and so important is the freedom when a human being truly perceives the good for what it is. Good in itself, beautiful, eternal, eternally valid, and at the same time recognizes that this is the good for me, and also is able, having perceived that, to follow it, to go for it.
But is that choice a choice that stems from the individual, or is it, as I've understood your position, it's actually determined by God? God has given him grace so that the individual will see that.
It's not determined in the sense of simply as it were physically caused. I mean, you could jog my elbow, my arm will move without any choice of mine.
Yes.
But you can't act on my will in that way. To persuade me to do something, you can say, if you do this, your salary will be doubled, your health will become far better, and all the rest of it. Of course, I'll then choose it. But you can't actually make me twist my mind so I make that choice. The essence of freedom is that as rational beings, we perceive the good, we recognize it for what it is, and then, of course, we choose it. Now, there are barriers. The barriers of psychological barriers. We've got weak will, we've got passions, we suffer from resentment, timidity, a degree of idleness. Now, we need God's grace to liberate us from those inhibiting factors so that when we see the good, we simply do go for it.
But when we see the good, is it conceptually possible that someone may see the good, recognize it's the good, and still say, no, thank you?
It's theoretically possible, just as it's theoretically possible that I should now make the choice to stand up and take off all my clothes and jump out of the window. It's theoretically possible, but I've got no inclination to do that. And so a human will that is operating properly, that perceives the good and is not inhibited in some way from following it, will go for it. And that is the exercise of freedom, true freedom, that has eternal value.
It sounds rather like the Islamic view that everything happens by the will of God, that effectively all our actions are at the end determined by God.
Yes.
But in that case, how does one explain horrendous evil? I've already referred to Darfur, Rwanda, the Holocaust. If we're going to attribute those to God, what sort of God is it that allows that to happen and in fact is the cause of them?
Now, there's the same problem here as there is on the doctrine of providence. Now, a traditional believer in God believes that the good things in my life are not just an accident, they're gifts from God, and I thank him for them, and I feel that I enjoy his protection. Now, a real belief in God must, I think, involve that. Now, you see, a philosopher of religion like yourself comes along and says, oh, but what about children who die of leukemia and the rest of it? Well, and so we must recognise God just isn't in control. Now, I think you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. A mind formed in traditional monotheism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, what will be given is this very strong sense that, yes, God is looking after me, determining my life, my painful, sorrowful experiences. I trust that I don't know what their purpose is, but God must know what he's doing, and ultimately I can be confident he will produce good out of this, or at least release me from this. That is my immediate point, given as a basic fact of faith. Now, when I meet the sort of case you mentioned, what can I say? Well, I don't understand it. But I'm not going to let that simply destroy what is any real faith in God. So likewise, take this question of grace. Now, it's the basic feeling of everyone formed in the Christian tradition, I think, to the Islamic tradition, that if I do make right choices, if I may feel that on the whole my life is a true response to God, this is not my work. In the words of St. Paul, it does not depend on human will or human exertion, but on God who has mercy. When I see people who do awful things, I say, there but for the grace of God go I. If I'd been put in that situation, I would have acted just as badly. If I'd been put in a situation where both choices were all-time fully equal, I was really seriously tempted by evil, I would have fallen for it. That's why I pray, lead me not into temptation.
But how would you respond to somebody like Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, who says, look, if you look at the suffering of innocent children, even though he may have heard what you've just said, he would say, it's not worth it. I stand in judgment on the God who will allow this, and I will not play God's game, because the price for what you're outlining is a world where there is an obscenity, an obscene amount of horror and suffering, and some protest atheists would just say, I will not accept that. How would you reply to that?
I think a believing Christian must begin with the faith he has received and the message which in Scripture is very centred on the gifts God is offering to those who believe. And the question of, frankly, the suffering of the rest of the world is not immediately addressed. Now, how do we respond to that? One possibility would be to say, my faith must just be a fairy story, it doesn't account for what the world is like. I think the reaction, however, the answer that will be given by anyone with faith will be, I don't understand, I haven't got the answer, God has not placed me in a situation.
Answer.
Yes, but I cannot renounce this sense of God, this gift from God, this awareness of a loving God who has chosen me. I just cannot forget that. And so I think the best answer is to say simply, we don't know. What I am quite certain about is that if my life in any way is true, saying yes to God, it's not because at some stage I made the heroic choice and God is patting me on the back. No, I didn't choose God. If it'd been left to me, I might well have chosen some much lower satisfactions. But God chose me, and He's made that choice, and fortunately, He's not going to let me fall away from that.
Let me ask one last question. What would you see then as the moral difference between you and Adolf Hitler? Because if everyone is determined, you have been placed in the fortunate position to have faith, to have reasonable health and the other good things. If everything is determined, surely one could say the same of Adolf Hitler. Are you any better morally than Adolf Hitler if there is no non-determined freedom?
Well, set myself aside for the moment. Imagine somebody we know is recognised, absolutely certainly, a jolly good person. Right. Now, they are a good person, and they have received gifts from God, and so they deserve admiration in that way, because we see in them the presence of God, the work of God. But I've no inclination to say of that somebody, how marvellous, they were heroic, they made difficult choices. No, it's the work of God that I recognise in that person, and that is what moral admiration actually consists of. Now, you say, but why, if we can't, in a sense, we can't say that Hitler was so wicked because he had all the possibilities, the options. I mean, let's forget Hitler. Let's imagine I'm just a criminal. Am I going to say of that criminal? He had the same chances that I had. He had free will. He could have chosen the good, but he chose evil. He's wicked. He deserves to be punished. I'm not ready to say that. I think it is probable that that criminals, the vast majority of criminals, and even a criminal like Adolf Hitler, with appalling upbringing, His father was absolute sadist, beat him savagely every day. He didn't have a chance. Now, you may say, why did God allow this? Well, he let Hitler have a life on earth that I think Hitler basically enjoyed, and Hitler did exercise certain human gifts of intelligence, I don't know. But you say, what about Hitler's ultimate destiny? Well, I've already said, I think the best answer is we don't know. If you press me, I offered you two answers. One is that, well, that's just, he'll cease to exist. I don't like the thought even of Adolf Hitler being in eternal hellfire forever and ever. That, I think, for most of us nowadays, the thought of that is utterly intolerable. And that does point to perhaps the possibility of, why didn't God act immediately? Well, why didn't he act immediately with all of us who went through bad phases in our life? We may ultimately think that God will so transform even Adolf Hitler that he'll be able to enter heaven. But we cannot say we know that. We cannot even say that this is a probable theory. What a good Christian will do is say, we don't know, but we can hope and pray that even Adolf Hitler, that everyone will ultimately be led into the bliss of heaven. But this will not be because we were put in a situation where we could make a totally open choice and evil is equally attractive. It will be because ultimately God makes the choice. And it's only if God ultimately makes the choice that it is realistic to think that everyone could ultimately be saved. Universalism, our hope that through God's love everyone will be saved, actually depends on the doctrine of predestination, that those God has chosen, he will not allow forever to fall away from him.
Professor Price, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.